April 8, 1944. At 27,000 feet over the frozen geometric farmlands of Lower Saxony, Germany, the sky was a brutal, unforgiving shade of indigo. The air was so thin that a man without an oxygen mask would lose consciousness in less than 3 minutes, and so cold that the oil in a fighter's engine would turn to useless black sludge if the internal temperatures weren't meticulously managed. This was the operational ceiling of the United States 8th Air Force, a theater of war where the elements were just as lethal as the Luftwaffe. Sitting in the cramped, freezing cockpit of a North American P-51B Mustang named Shangri-La, Captain Dominic Salvatore Gentile was scanning the blinding horizon. Known to everyone as Don, Gentile was not your typical reluctant warrior. He wasn't a dirt-poor farm boy or a methodical, rigid mechanic. He was a flamboyant, incredibly charismatic 23-year-old from Piqua, Ohio, the son of Italian immigrants. Long before the war broke out, while other kids were dreaming of flying, Gentile's father had actually bought him an Aerosport biplane. He had logged hundreds of hours buzzing the Ohio countryside before he was even legally an adult. When the United States Army Air Corps initially rejected him because he lacked college credits, Gentile didn't give up. He simply crossed the border, joined the Royal Canadian Air Force, and ended up flying Supermarine Spitfires for the legendary RAF Eagle squadrons over the English Channel. By the time he transferred into the USAAF's elite 4th Fighter Group based at Debden, England, Gentile was already a seasoned killer. But he didn't fly like a killer. He flew like an artist. Other pilots fought the controls, muscling their aircraft through the sky through sheer force of will. Gentile danced. He possessed an innate, almost supernatural understanding of aerodynamics. He could feel the exact moment a wing was about to stall, and he could ride that microscopic edge of failure indefinitely. But the canvas he was painting on in the spring of 1944 was deeply flawed. History remembers the P-51 Mustang as the ultimate Allied fighter, but Gentile was not flying the famous bubble-canopied P-51D that would later dominate the skies. He was flying the earlier P-51B. The P-51B was a technological marvel, pairing the revolutionary laminar flow wing with the supercharged Packard Merlin engine, giving it the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But it had 2 terrifying, fatal flaws. First, it featured a razorback canopy. The fuselage came up high behind the pilot's head, meaning Gentile had almost zero rearward visibility. To see if a German fighter was dropping onto his tail, he had to physically throw his aircraft into violent, sweeping S-turns just to check his blind spots. Second, and far more dangerously, the P-51B was only equipped with 4 50-caliber machine guns, not 6. Worse still, the guns were mounted at a severe angle inside the thin wings. Under the extreme high G-forces of a turning dogfight, the ammunition belts would frequently kink and jam. A pilot could outfly a German ace, perfectly align his gun sight, press the trigger, and be met with nothing but the terrifying silence of jammed weapons. To survive in a P-51B, a pilot had to be absolutely flawless in his approach. He couldn't afford to spray and pray. Every trigger pull had to be a calculated, surgical strike, executed before the G-forces bent the ammunition feeds. Before we follow Captain Gentile into the absolute maelstrom over Brunswick, if you believe the grit and mechanical realities of the Second World War deserve to be remembered without the Hollywood filter, please hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that real, unfiltered military history is worth sharing. Subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this engagement. And I want to ask you, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. We read every single comment, and we want to honor their legacy. Now, let's go back to the freezing skies over Germany. On the morning of April 8th, the 8th Air Force had launched a massive armada of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators to obliterate the German industrial center at Brunswick. Gentile and the 4th Fighter Group were flying high above the bomber stream, acting as the ultimate shield. The Luftwaffe knew they were coming, and they weren't holding anything back. As the bomber stream crossed into the airspace over Hanover, the American radios erupted. Gentile looked down through the plexiglass of his razorback canopy and witnessed a horrifying spectacle. Climbing up from the German countryside was a Gefechtsverband, a massive, heavily armored battle formation of Luftwaffe fighters. There were upwards of 60 to 80 German aircraft. Highly experienced pilots in Focke-Wulf FW-190s were forming up in line abreast formations, preparing to sweep through the American bombers like a scythe. Above them, nimble Messerschmitt Bf-109s were flying top cover, waiting to drop on any American escort fighter that dared to intervene. The 4th Fighter Group was vastly outnumbered. The standard doctrine when facing a massive organized fighter screen was to maintain altitude, wait for the Germans to commit, and attempt to break their formation through disciplined, coordinated passes.
But Gentile, flying alongside his legendary wingman, Captain John Godfrey, didn't believe in waiting. He knew that the moment those Focke-Wulfs reached the bomber stream, dozens of American crews would be slaughtered. The only way to stop a heavily armored Gefechtsverband was to completely shatter its cohesion before it could strike. Gentile reached down and yanked the lever to jettison his external fuel tanks. The heavy drop tanks tumbled away into the slipstream. He didn't wait for the rest of his squadron. He didn't wait for the German top cover to make their move. Gentile simply rolled Shangri-La onto her back, pointed the Razorback's nose directly into the center of the 60-plane German armada, and shoved the throttle to the firewall. The sky over Brunswick was about to become his personal canvas. When you roll a 9,000-pound fighter aircraft inverted and pull the nose straight down into a massive enemy formation, you are not just fighting the Luftwaffe, you are fighting physics. As Captain Don Gentile's North American P-51B Mustang plummeted toward the German Gefechtsverband over Brunswick, the airspeed indicator rapidly swept past 400, then 450 miles per hour. The revolutionary laminar flow wings of the Mustang sliced through the freezing, thin air with minimal drag, allowing the aircraft to build speed at a terrifying rate. Inside the cramped, unheated cockpit, the roar of the supercharged Packard Merlin engine became a physical vibration, rattling Gentile's teeth. He was diving straight into the teeth of 60 to 80 heavily armed German fighters. The Focke-Wulf FW-190s were stacked in line abreast formations, a solid wall of flying artillery preparing to tear through the American B-17 bombers above.
To break a formation of that size, you cannot peck at the edges. You have to drive a wedge straight through the center and force the enemy pilots to break their disciplined ranks in pure reflexive panic. But Gentile had a massive handicap. As he closed the distance on the trailing FW-190s, he had to navigate the fatal flaw of his early model Mustang. The 450 caliber machine guns crammed into his wings had sharply angled ammunition feeds. If Gentile pulled a hard, high-G turn to track an evading German fighter and pressed the trigger, the immense centrifugal force would bind the ammunition belts against their metal chutes. The guns would instantly jam, transforming his state-of-the-art fighter into a helpless, unarmed glider deep in enemy territory. To kill the enemy, Gentile had to unload the aircraft. He had to momentarily relax back pressure on the control stick, dropping the aircraft into a 1G or even 0G flight path, creating a perfectly smooth, stable platform before he could fire. He couldn't yank and bank. He had to anticipate the enemy's movements with the precision of a psychic, placing his aircraft exactly where it needed to be so he could fire in a straight line. At 500 yards, the massive German formation filled his reflector gun sight. Gentile picked the lead Focke-Wulf in the closest element. He didn't slam the controls. He eased the stick forward, letting the Mustang float into a zero-G trajectory. He clamped his hand down on the trigger. The 4 Browning machine guns roared flawlessly. Because he only had 4 guns instead of the later standard of 6, he lacked the sheer volume of fire to simply spray the target. His aim had to be surgical. It was. A concentrated stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds converged perfectly on the FW-190's thick BMW 801 radial engine. The kinetic impact shattered the cowling and severed the fuel lines. The German fighter instantly erupted into a blinding sheet of flame, violently snapping to the right before tumbling toward the earth. 1 kill. The psychological effect was immediate. The sight of a flaming FW-190 falling through their ranks, combined with the terrifying roar of diving Mustangs, shattered the German discipline. The Gefechtsverband dissolved. German pilots broke left and right in sheer panic to avoid the debris and the diving Americans. The cohesive wall of armor was instantly fractured into dozens of chaotic individual dogfights. Gentile had done his job. The American bombers were safe, but by sacrificing his altitude and diving into the center of the formation, he was now completely surrounded. The German top cover of Messerschmitt Bf-109s saw the American Mustangs drop to the deck and immediately rolled over to exterminate them. Tracers snapped past Gentile's razorback canopy. He hauled back on the control stick, pulling the P-51B into a gut-wrenching maximum G climbing turn to meet the threat. This is where Don Gentile proved he was not just a pilot, but an artist. In a tight, sustained turn, an aircraft's wing generates massive amounts of lift, but it also generates massive amounts of drag. If you pull too hard, the smooth airflow separates from the top of the wing. The aircraft begins to shudder violently, a phenomenon known as the stall buffet. If a pilot continues to pull, the wing entirely loses lift and the aircraft will violently snap roll into an uncontrollable spin. Most pilots felt that shudder and instantly released the stick in terror. Gentile thrived in it. As a Bf-109 dropped onto his tail, Gentile pulled the Mustang right into the violent, bone-rattling stall buffet and held it there. He rode the absolute ragged edge of aerodynamic failure, feeling the airflow through the rudder pedals and the leather seat. He danced the Mustang in a horizontal circle so tight that the pursuing German pilot simply couldn't match the geometry. The Bf-109, lacking the aerodynamic finesse of the laminar flow wing, bled off its airspeed and began to drift wide. In a fraction of a second, Gentile snapped his nose down, smoothly unloaded the G-forces to protect his ammunition belts, and fired. The burst tore through the Messerschmitt's cockpit. The Bf-109 flipped onto its back and plummeted into the clouds below. 2 kills. But the sky was still swarming. Dozens of furious Luftwaffe pilots were reorganizing, realizing that a handful of American Mustangs had just humiliated their entire battle formation. Gentile was burning through his fuel and his limited ammunition at a terrifying rate. He needed to change the equation, and he wasn't going to do it alone. Descending through the chaos, matching Gentile's every maneuver with telepathic precision, was his wingman, Captain John Godfrey. Together they were known across the 8th Air Force as Damon and Pythias, the deadliest 2-ship element in the European theater. The true nightmare for the Luftwaffe was only just beginning. In the chaotic, swirling vortex of a multi-bogey dogfight, a fighter pilot without a wingman is simply a pilot waiting to die. When Captain Don Gentile bled off his airspeed and pulled his North American P-51B Mustang into a ragged, stall-buffeting turn over Brunswick, he had successfully destroyed 2 German fighters and shattered the Luftwaffe's defensive screen, but he had also painted a massive target on his own back.
Dozens of furious Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s were swarming the airspace, desperate to exact revenge on the lone American who had humiliated their battle formation. With the severe blind spot created by the Mustang's razorback canopy, Gentile couldn't see the German fighters maneuvering into his 6 o'clock position, but Captain John Godfrey could. Godfrey was Gentile's wingman, and together they formed the deadliest two-ship element in the 8th Air Force. They didn't fly in a rigid parade ground formation. They flew a loose tactical spread, separated by hundreds of yards of airspace, crossing each other's flight paths in a continuous weaving pattern. This geometry was specifically designed to solve the visibility problem. By flying wide, Godfrey was essentially acting as Gentile's rear-view mirror, and vice versa. If a German fighter tried to drop onto Gentile's tail, Godfrey was already perfectly positioned to pinch the enemy in a deadly crossfire. As a Bf-109 dove out of the clouds, lining up the heavy, unarmored engine cowling of Gentile's Shangri-La in its gun sight, Godfrey barked a single sharp warning over the radio. Gentile didn't hesitate. Trusting his wingman's eyes over his own instincts, he slammed the control stick forward, violently dumping his nose into a -G dive.
The German pilot, startled by the sudden disappearance of his target, hesitated for a fraction of a second. That was all Godfrey needed. A devastating burst of .50 caliber fire from Godfrey's Mustang sawed through the Messerschmitt's fuselage, sending it spiraling out of the fight. With his tail clear, Gentile hauled the control stick back into his lap, converting his dive speed into a sweeping vertical climb. He crested the top of his arc and looked down through the top of his canopy. Below him, a Focke-Wulf FW-190 was frantically trying to disengage from the melee, its pilot pushing the throttle to the firewall to run for the safety of a German airfield. Gentile rolled inverted and dropped like a stone. He didn't bother trying to match the FW-190's evasive maneuvers. He let the brilliant aerodynamics of the laminar flow wing do the work, building up a massive speed advantage. He closed the distance to 300 yards. Remembering the fatal flaw of his early model Mustang's wing guns, Gentile consciously relaxed his grip on the stick, momentarily unloading the heavy G-forces from the airframe. The ammunition belts straightened in their chutes. Gentile squeezed the trigger. The 4 Browning machine guns hammered flawlessly. The armor-piercing rounds walked cleanly across the Focke-Wulf's right wing root. The concentrated kinetic energy severed the main spar, and the wing simply folded backward. The FW-190 violently tumbled into a terminal spin, becoming Gentile's 3rd confirmed kill of the day. The German Gefechtsverband was completely broken. The surviving Luftwaffe pilots, demoralized and out of position, scattered into the clouds. The American bomber stream cruised on toward Brunswick, entirely untouched by the fighter screen that was supposed to slaughter them. When Don Gentile and John Godfrey finally touched down at the 4th Fighter Group's base at Debden, England, the ground crew swarmed Shangri-La. With those 3 kills on April 8, 1944, Gentile's official score of destroyed enemy aircraft, combining air kills and strafed kills on the ground, surpassed the legendary World War I record of 26 kills set by Eddie Rickenbacker. The press descended on the base. General Dwight D. Eisenhower personally dubbed Gentile a one-man air force. He was the undisputed king of the European skies, a 23-year-old artist who painted with gravity, kinetic energy, and .5 caliber lead. But aerial combat is a merciless profession, and physics does not care about newspaper headlines. 5 days later, on April 13th, the media was gathered at Debden. Gentile's combat tour was officially over. He had survived the absolute worst the Third Reich could throw at him, and he was being sent home to the United States on a massive war bond tour. The cameras were rolling, capturing footage of the legendary pilot before he packed his bags. Gentile, full of the flamboyant hubris that had kept him alive in combat, decided to give the press a show.
He fired up Shangri-La, took off, and brought the heavy Mustang down right onto the deck for a low-level buzz job across the airfield.
It was a fatal miscalculation of the very machine he had mastered. At low speeds and ultra-low altitude, the massive Packard Merlin engine in the nose of the P-51 makes the aircraft incredibly nose-heavy. As Gentile banked sharply just feet above the grass, the inner wing lost lift. Without the altitude to recover from the stall, physics took over. Shangri-La, the aircraft that had survived dozens of dogfights over Germany, slammed brutally into the English dirt. The heavy Mustang bounced, tearing off its landing gear and crushing its radiator scoop before grinding to a halt in a cloud of dust and shredded aluminum. Its back was literally broken. Gentile climbed out of the shattered cockpit unhurt, but his combat career was instantly over. The legendary commander of the 4th Fighter Group, Colonel Don Blakesley, was famously unforgiving of showboating that cost the military an airplane. He grounded Gentile on the spot. The one-man Air Force was sent home, not as a conquering hero leading his squadron, but as a pilot who had survived the Luftwaffe only to be defeated by his own ego. Tragically, Gentile's luck ran out entirely in 1951 when he was killed in the crash of a T-33 Shooting Star jet trainer in Maryland. He was just 30 years old.
The history of the Second World War is not a collection of flawless superheroes. It is the story of deeply flawed, incredibly brave young men operating high-performance machinery on the absolute edge of human endurance. Here at WWII Frontliner, we don't sanitize history. We dig into the flight logs, the mechanical realities, and the brutal mathematics of survival to bring you the stories that the textbooks gloss over. If this story reminded you of the sheer, unapologetic grit required to fly the early P-51 Mustangs, please hit that like button. It costs you nothing, but it ensures these incredible archives reach the people who deserve to hear them. Subscribe if you haven't already. We don't do Hollywood myths. We go into the cockpit and into the mechanics that actually won the air war. And before you go, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. We read every single comment, and we want to ensure these names are never lost to time. Don Gentile trusted the aerodynamics, but the physics always collected their due. Don't quit on this channel. We'll see you in the next one.